Okay, without further ado, welcome back. Welcome to our keynote session number 2. Some administrative matters beforehand. The session will run from 12 p.m. currently, all the way up to 1:30 p.m. Right, so if you have any questions that you want to ask, please leave it to the end of the presentation, or please feel free to log in or to click on the Q&A function in your Zoom to actually ask any questions that you have. And if there are repeated questions, feel free to also upvote or downvote. There's no downvote. Let's just upvote on the questions that you want Professor Cindy Shen to actually ask at the end of her presentation. So I'm your moderator for today. My name is Elmie. I'm from the Department of Communications and New Media at the National University of Singapore. So let me firstly begin by introducing our keynote speaker for this keynote speaker number 2, session number 2. So we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Cindy Shen, or in her full name, Cuihua Shen, Cindy. She joins us from University of California, Davis, as a professor of communication. And I believe the time there right now should be around 9 p.m. also. Cindy, yeah. So thank you so much for joining us and taking the time of a very hectic day, I assume, to actually join us. So Professor Shen is also concurrently the co-director for the Computational Communication Research Lab at the University of California, Davis. Apart from that, she is also the chair for the Computational Methods Division at the International Communication Association, the ICA, and also the founding associate editor for the Journal of Computational Communication Research, as well as the associate editor of a journal that we all mostly are familiar with, Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication. If you were to just find out when just a little bit of background, when I was finding out information about Professor Shen to actually introduce her, you'll be surprised that even though she looks like she is a new researcher, but her impact in the field has been astounding for a very new researcher, making very strong impact and making very strong inroads in the field of computational communication, especially from an associational level in our field of communication. And that's where her background lies. And a little bit of a background also, Professor Shen is a proud alumni, if I may, from the Department of Communications and New Media in NUS itself, before moving on to do her PhD at Annenberg in USC. So she was basically, if I remember clearly, was also possibly also my tutor at that point in time, and she was doing a master's and I was an undergraduate in year 2005, where she graduated from CNM. So we are glad to have you here back with us, at least in this e-forum. Okay, so without further ado, let me just briefly share with you what Professor Shen is going to share with us in her talk today. So her talk today, she'll be sharing on the proliferation of misinformation in today's digital media environment, and basically talking about how it threatens national security, social cohesion, and public health. Okay, and in this talk also, Professor Shen will be outlining the unique characteristics of multi-modal misinformation, as well as their correctional methods, and propose potential solutions to address these challenges. And if I may just link it to the excellent previous presentation by Professor, is that a lot of questions were asked on the practical applications or the policy implications of this. So I hope we gain more insights from Professor Shen's presentation. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Shen. So please.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction, and also for inviting me to share my work at this conference. It gives me great pleasure to virtually come back to the National University of Singapore, and specifically the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. As Dr. Nekmat mentioned, I received my MA from CNN, Communication and New Media, before obtaining my PhD in the US. I have very fond memories of my time at NUS. and the wonderful mentors I had who left a lasting impact on me as a scholar. People often say that being invited to give a talk at your alma mater means you have made it in academia. So I'm very happy that I have made it as a scholar today. So jokes aside, today I'm very excited to share my research with you all on how to fight multimodal misinformation in online networks. First, a little bit of background of the topic itself. In 2018, the journal Science published a review piece titled "The Science of Fake News," which seemed to suggest that the study of fake news or misinformation has entered into prominence in academia. So in this piece, they gave a formal definition of what fake news is. So it's defined as fabricated information that mimics news media content and form, but not in organizational process or intent. Fake news outlets in turn lack the news media's editorial norms and processes for ensuring the accuracy and credibility of information. Right? So the term fake news was populated by no other than presidential candidate Donald Trump at that time. The public now may casually refer to misinformation as fake news. It can be understood as, the fabricated information that mimics news media. But on the other hand, this term carries political bias because Trump himself repeatedly used fake news to describe anything that does not support his agenda, right? So in this infamous tweet, he slammed reputable news outlets such as New York Times as fake news, obviously in an attempt to use fake news as a political weapon. Here's another more recent example. This was taken on Tuesday, October the 6th, 2020, right before last year's election. And Trump again claimed the poll to be fake because it showed he's losing in Pennsylvania, which was a key state. So here, fake does not mean fake anymore. It becomes a label for anything against him. So for this reason, there are also many scholars who oppose the term fake news altogether because it is too weaponized and too politicized to retain its original meaning. So the two terms that we commonly use in the space of misinformation research is first, misinformation, right, which refers to false or misleading information. And the second term is disinformation, which refers to false information that is purposely spread to deceive people. So there is this intent. And I probably do not have to preach to this crowd how detrimental misinformation is, because it damages our trust in public institutions, threatens democracy, and literally it kills people. Misinformation about COVID-19, for example, has literally resulted in lost lives around the world that could be otherwise prevented. And we should add the compounding effect from online networks, because misinformation really gains its power from dissemination in online networks. So again, in the same piece, they cited a study looking at spread or diffusion of misinformation, and they found that false information on Twitter is retweeted by more people and far more rapidly than true information, especially on the topic of politics. So very harmful, very quickly. Now, I also want to give you guys a bird's eye view of the landscape of misinformation research before delving into specific empirical research that I'm going to talk about today. So I have summarized misinformation research into 6 large groups, and all of them are somewhat connected closely to computational social science. So first group is the identification of misinformation. And this part is very closely associated with automated text analysis or image analysis. So in this group, researchers are working very hard in order to try to identify misinformation as quickly and as automated as possible. The second group is try to look at the dissemination or engagement of misinformation. Like the study I just mentioned, right? People have found out that misinformation actually spreads or was disseminated much faster, had a better reach than true information. And the third chunk of study looking at the message itself. For example, what kind of frames do misinformation possess? It's conspiracy or something else? And are there emotion or sentiment in the text? Does it contain evidence? For example, is it anecdotal evidence? Is it statistical evidence, and so on? The next group looked at modality, and this is something that I'm most interested in, and also the central point of today's talk is to look at multiple modalities, not just text, but also image, audio, video, etc. And yet another group of researchers look at the users. So instead of focusing on misinformation itself, they look at the users and what kind of users are more susceptible to misinformation. For example, susceptibility may take the form of conspiratorial thinking, people's political orientation, their gender or demographics, their digital media literacy, and so on. And lastly, scholars have focused on the impact of misinformation. For example, what kind of misinformation do people perceive to be highly accurate? Are there any lingering effect of misinformation after correction efforts, and so on? So very similar to the research of misinformation, we could also summarize the research on how to counter misinformation into the same groups, which I'm not going to spend too much time on. Right? So one group looked at how to debunk misinformation, but debunking has this connotation that it happens after you're exposed to misinformation. So it's after the fact. And then a second group says, you know, if we don't do it after, maybe we can do it before, right? So that's the paradigm of pre-bunking, right? So, I mean, in other words, if we can develop vaccines for COVID, we can probably also develop vaccines for maybe misinformation about COVID. So in this realm, scholars have tried to develop inoculation efforts. So to inoculate people before they're exposed to certain misinformation. And sometimes it gives you better results than debunking, which is after the fact. And then yet another group of researchers tried to look at various ways of label misinformation as people are consuming them. So you probably see on Twitter or Facebook, you know, during political turmoil or like last year's election, for example, as you're consuming certain nuggets on these social media sites, you'll see simultaneously a label of whether this is contested information or not, right? So that's labeling. And yet another group tried to look at other interventions. That's not debunking, not pre-bunking, not labeling. Okay, for example, we can develop low-cost information literacy campaigns. So right before people consume something, maybe we can, you know, teach them something about, you need to check before spreading this on Twitter and things like that. And again, people have looked at user features. What kind of users are more susceptible to corrective efforts and so on? What kind of users are more stubborn to corrective efforts and so on? So we could adapt the correction efforts to user features. And lastly, people have looked at the impact of correction efforts, whether there is any backfire effect. The more correction you're exposed to, the more stubborn you become, for example, or any spillover effect or continuation. So this is a very quick bird's eye view, you know, in 2 minutes about what this field has been developing over the past few years. So from that, I have distilled a few promising directions in this field. And we're going to focus on the first direction, that is multimodal misinformation, and specifically on image, audio, and video. And there are other promising directions I think would lead to very fruitful research efforts down the line. For example, developing interventions and studying unexpected outcomes, right? Maybe misinformation campaigns or correction campaigns could inadvertently push the users to the other side. And we have seen them in empirical studies as well. And another interesting direction is misinformation from authorities. We tend to think that people look to authorities for true information, right? But if the 2020 election had taught us anything, that is, misinformation may very well come from authorities. And what do you do with that? And the last promising direction is a study across multiple domains like health and politics, etc. So today's talk, I want to focus on the very first promising direction, and that is multimodal misinformation. And for good reason. That is because most existing work on fake news or misinformation focus on text only. But we all know that people increasingly consume information in a multimodal format. Case in point. So this is a screenshot taken minutes ago of the top stories on a website called Snopes.com. People familiar with Snopes would know that this is one of the largest fact-checking websites in the United States. As you can see, every story has a thumbnail image with it. You cannot find a headline or a story without some kind of multimodal information. There's another example taken minutes ago today of this prominent Chinese news outlet called Zaobao in Singapore, right? We see again that images accompany almost every headline. Now, if you click through it, maybe you'll even find audio or video, right? So in short, people increasingly consume news in multimodal format, and misinformation research absolutely needs to catch up. On the other hand, decades of research on multimodal information processing shows that users process and perceive visual misinformation fundamentally different from text-based misinformation, because visuals are more easily recalled, shared, and are often more persuasive than words. Example, images historically been perceived as photographic proof of the depicted events, right? We even have this expression, seeing is believing, which means when we see images, we think they are real, right? The default is that they are real, and that photographs are convincing proof of events that happened or may be happening. An example of this is the moon landing, right? Now, the only way I know it happened is the photographic evidence like this one. Otherwise, I had no idea that it happened. I knew it happened because I see a photo like this one. While image manipulation technology could be used effectively, such as in film industry, with modern technology, it is getting easier to deceive and manipulate viewers or influence them using forgeries. It can change beliefs, cause distrust, change viewpoints, or manipulate people's emotions. A strong example of this is this image and headline shown here from the 2004 US presidential election, where an image of the presidential nominee, John Kerry, the guy here, circulated on the media, sharing the stage with activist Jane Fonda, the girl over there, at the Vietnam-era anti-war rally back in the 70s. Now, regardless of the viewer's political opinion, this picture showed contrary to the image John Kerry wanted to present at that time. Therefore, this image was very damaging to his political campaign. However, this image was a composition and a visual forgery by a Bush supporter, Richard Taylor. At that time, Bush was running against Kerry. So now this forgery was exposed because the originals were found in archival sources. And in fact, in this case, it was easy to track the maker of the image who actually faced the lawsuit. By that time, when the forgery was uncovered, this image had been circulating a lot and even appeared on New York Times. We all know that when New York Times runs the retraction, the story may not be viewed as widely as the original was. So the damage had already been done. The point is, human beings just simply lack the ability and the technical tools to tell the fake from the real images. Even very big media outlets such as New York Times will fall for it, right? So with the wide availability of photo editing tools, we can no longer ensure that photographic records accurately reflect reality. Fake images that can be extremely harmful, and we have no tools to help us. And furthermore, whether informing the viewers later about the forgery changed or would change the initial impact of the image first time, studies show the impact of images on memory, perception, and decision-making has conclusive evidence that showing a retraction may not necessarily undo the damage the first time. Here's another example. This image displayed here of a bikini-wearing, rifle-toting Sarah Palin began circulating on the internet within days of the announcement that Sarah Palin, the Alaska governor, had been tapped for the vice presidential spot on the 2008 Republican ticket. However, it's purely a digital manipulation created by pasting an image of her head onto this original photo of a bikini-wearing, gun-toting woman. Here is another example. Sometimes even journalists at the big media outlets, like The Economist, they may commit photo manipulation knowingly. So The Economist was in hot water after running an extremely edited photograph of President Obama on the Louisiana beach. And this is around 2010, when there was a huge oil spill in the Louisiana Bay. So the cover photo shows Obama alone on the beach, but the original photo shows that Obama was in fact not alone at all, right? So the altered image crops out two people, right? Admiral Allen of the Coast Guard, and also this woman, a Louisiana parish president. And sometimes a fake image does not have to involve deliberate photoshopping or manipulation. Showing here is President Trump, who had been receiving treatment for coronavirus at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center back in October 2020. Right? So his team released two photographs right after, which were meant to suggest that Donald Trump was recuperating rapidly and busy at work. But those images have been met with lots of scrutiny, undercutting the message the president hoped to send. In the first photo, Trump was dressed in a suit, seated at a round table inside the presidential suite, appearing to be reviewing a document. In the right side photo, he was dressed in a white shirt, seated at the end of the long table inside a conference room, right? So as a viewer, what conclusion would you draw after seeing these two photos? Probably that Trump was doing very well despite coronavirus, and he was working long hours, given the change of location and change of clothes, right? Wrong. Now, people on social media quickly found very damning evidence on the EXIF information of these pictures. EXIF stands for Exchangeable Image File Format. It's a standard that specifies the format for images and sound used by digital cameras. You can think of EXIF as sort of a big data or digital trace you left behind every time you use digital camera or even use your phone. So when the photographer released those images, they released the EXIF information as well. So people found out that the first photo was taken on October the 3rd at 5:25 p.m. And the second was taken merely 10 minutes later at 5:35. This means that the entire photo shoot was staged to purposefully mislead the public to believe that Trump was doing well and working long hours. Right? All this was a staged performance. So what does that tell us? It tells us that images do not have to be deliberately photoshopped to become fake. In this case, these images were created purposefully to mislead. A similar example is this one circulating around during Hurricane Sandy at New York City some years ago. In this photo, Lady Liberty looks like she's under attack from Sandy's massive storms, right? But in reality, she's being washed away by Hollywood special effects team behind 2004's movie, The Day After Tomorrow. So in this case, the photo was not manipulated. It was taken from this film, but it was used purposefully in the wrong context. We call this misattribution. And internet memes would often fall into this category of misattribution as well. In this example, the photo of Einstein is real, but the quote was not. So again, we're using a real image in the wrong context. So the point being, image veracity is contextual. Images or videos or other multimodal information has to be judged within a context. Otherwise, we cannot judge their veracity or credibility. So the next question is, how do we define fake or forged images? So from the examples I just showed you, there are 4 ways we define fake or forged images. The first is composition. It means putting 2 photos together, maybe pasting one person's head onto another. And the second is retouching. It is changing specific element in the existing image. And the third is elimination. It means to crop out, eliminate certain parts of the image. And the last one is the hardest to spot, and that's misattribution. It is to put an image or video in the wrong context. Now, once we define the fake or forged images, the next question is how to detect them. Let's go back to the first image of moon landing, right? How do we know it's real or fake? The technology that allows for creating manipulated or completely fabricated images from scratch has far outpaced technological methods for detecting such manipulations. So we find ourselves in an unfortunate spot. There are more advanced technology to make fake images than there are technologies available for us to detect them. There are some analysis methods that could detect fake images from looking into the metadata, like the EXIF example, the encryption method, or in this case, developed by my collaborators in computer graphics by analyzing shadows and perspectives, right? Because the real world has constraints. If you track shadows, it will relate to sources of light, and images are formed by perspective projection, and we can apply math to see what these constraints turn into an image. When constraints are violated, that invalidates the image, right? That's about as technical I can get into this method. Sufficient to say that this is not accessible to the average person like me, right? So without going into too much detail, this analysis shows the moon landing did actually happen. But these methods are very complex and they're not accessible to a regular internet user. So let's look at this example. As users and viewers, we might assume we have the ability to identify forgeries. But not only successful forgeries are hard to identify. When people think they found something, they're often very wrong, right? So this is an infamous example. In 2016, Republican Vice President nominee Mike Pence, he posted this image on Twitter, taken at a New York City restaurant called Chili's, with his wife, the lady dressed in black, and his daughter, the lady who's dressed in white. If I ask you to look at the image very closely, can you spot anything unusual with it? Well, many internet users did spot something wrong. They immediately created a buzz about the image's authenticity on the internet. They generated speculations and very interesting stories because the daughter of Mike Pence doesn't have a reflection in the mirror, right? Some overzealous Twitter users started calling her a vampire. But as you can see in this analysis, the fact that her reflection is not in the mirror is actually consistent with the geometry of the scene. Through analyzing reflection, how reflection behaves under perspective projection. Applying some math, you can see that the tip of her nose should be behind Pence. That's why we do not see her reflection in the mirror, because she was overshadowed by Pence. So even when there's a growing awareness that images no longer represent authentic proof of reality, we are actually very bad at finding the manipulations, and therefore we are super vulnerable to them. So now I've explained the rationale of the series of studies carried out at my lab, funded by the United States National Science Foundation. So we begin this project by doing a focus group study, which was published in the Proceeding of Kai in 2018. So we're trying to better understand how people make judgments concerning online images. Okay, so we administered a focus group, and then we invited participants to come in and we show them lots and lots of images. We asked them their thought process about whether these images are manipulated or real, authentic, and give us evidence. Okay, so we created lots of images using the 4 methods: composition, elimination, retouching, and misattribution. And then we create mock-ups that include the medium, such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We include the outlet information with varying reputability, like New York Times, very reputable, others not so much. And we also accompany these images by contextual commentaries or stories, right? So this is an example. This is a mock-up of an image shown on Facebook, and then the publisher is BBC World News. It has URL, it has engagements, people have commented, there are likes and share statistics, and so on. So the markup was created with the purpose that it looks exactly like how you would encounter a news story with an image thumbnail on social media. So this is an example. So we recruited people, and we try to vary their political leanings as much as possible. We conducted the study at 2 sites. So here's the findings. We found that participants made judgments based mostly on non-image cues. And the most important factor in determining image credibility was the source of the image. The textual information also played a significant role. What does that mean? So if we take this example, the image itself actually was not important in people's decision-making about whether this is credible. They just assume it is. They look for other cues in order to make their decision. So if it's on Facebook, maybe some people would think that's not credible because it's Facebook. And then it's from BBC World News. So maybe some people would think, since it's from BBC, it must be credible or not credible. And then there are, about 1,500 people who like it or share it. And that signals to some people, and this is credible or not credible. In other words, the non-image cues are important in making a decision about credibility, but the image itself is not. And also, the source is the most important for deciding the credibility. And we also found that the credibility evaluation tend to be very hasty. People don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Their default is that it is credible. And sometimes when we probe them, when we ask, if you think this is wrong, then what exactly in the image is wrong? And participants will often point to the area that is not photoshopped. Right? In other words, the photoshopped areas, they thought there was no problem with it, but they will tend to point at areas where the image was kept intact. So again, this tells us that people are actually terrible at telling image manipulation. At the same time, we are very vulnerable to fall prey to multimodal misinformation. So the second study continues on this line of research, and we want to quantitatively look at the factors that would predict people's credibility judgments of online images with the information we gathered from the focus group study. So this time, we systematically included many, many factors. The first factor is source trustworthiness, right? We manipulated source trustworthiness. So for example, New York Times would be considered highly trustworthy, and BuzzFeed, which is a tabloid in the United States, is considered not so trustworthy. And of course, there is this generic individual on Twitter, right, which is, again, not very trustworthy. So we varied the degree of source trustworthiness. The second factor we tested is the source and media type. For example, is it news organization or individuals? News organizations tend to be more trustworthy, right? And is it website versus social media? typically people tend to think websites to be more trustworthy than social media. So an example of this is we manipulated, for example, New York Times website versus New York Times Facebook page. And another factor that we manipulated is intermediaries or secondhand sources. So information sharing and curating online foregrounds the importance of second-order sources that share or endorse information published originally by somebody else. So for example, in this tweet, this Japanese guy called Yasuga posted a picture. Now, the fact that Elon Musk liked it is critical for me to assess its trustworthiness, right? Because I do not know this Japanese guy called Yasuga, but I do know about Elon Musk, who is a public figure. So the fact Elon Musk liked it, for me, this is an endorsement cue. However, a few studies have explicitly examined how credibility evaluations vary based on perceived trustworthiness of intermediaries such as Elon Musk. And also we are interested in knowing what happens when the credibility of the source and the credibility of the secondhand source are somewhat at odds with each other, right? So what happens then? And another factor we manipulated is what we call the bandwagon cues. Here shown as the number of comments, number of likes, and retweets. So these social buttons on social media often aggregate opinions about specific stories. So some studies have shown that consistent evidence for bandwagon effects or virality effects. So people are more likely to agree with a perceived consensus from aggregate metrics. So we expect the same heuristics for online images too. And lastly, we include some covariates from these individuals. So first is their digital media literacy, whether they have photography or digital imaging experience, how much internet skills they possess, and their social media use. And another thing is to look at people's pre-existing issue attitude, because studies have shown that confirmation bias is very strong in misinformation research. Confirmation bias means that you are more likely to believe something is true if you already agree with that stance. Okay, so for example, if a gun control activist, someone who already agreed that gun needs to be controlled, and if that person is presented with image or information that agree with their pre-existing stance, they're more likely to think that's credible. Makes sense, right? Okay. So with all these factors, we did a partial factorial design. It's 28 conditions. It's a massive, massive online experiment. All these manipulations are pre-tested. We used 6 distinct images with 28 different mockups. So that resulted in more than 150 individual conditions. So I just want to show you a few conditions so you get an idea of our mockups. So this is a mockup for one of the conditions. It's a Facebook post allegedly created by Bill Gates, right? Bill Gates being the original source, and shared by NPR, National Public Radio. So NPR here being the secondary source. And this image was modified to display airstrikes in Syria. Note that our design recognizes the image consumption evaluation are always very contextual, right? As I said earlier, image veracity is always contextual. So we always include a headline, right? So there is some text to accompany that image. With every fabricated image, we have a headline. This is similar to how images are usually presented and viewed online. Right, so these are the specific elements we manipulated. And here's some more. And here's another image. As you can see, the Photoshop job isn't great to begin with. And we purposefully kept it at that. Okay, so with all these images and these conditions, we recruited a very, very large subject pool from Mechanical Turk in the United States. We also have a student sample to pair with it. In the end, Mechanical Turk and student sample gave very similar results. So findings. We manipulated so many factors. But we found absolutely no effects for the source of media type, for the intermediary or secondary source, and for the bandwagon metrics. So there's absolutely no effects from these factors. What did have an impact are actually something we measured from the individuals. Okay, two things. First is digital media literacy. Okay, so viewers' skills and experience with digital photography. It greatly impacted their image credibility evaluations. The more knowledge and experience people have with the internet in general and digital photography in particular, the better they are at evaluating image credibility. So our results suggest that to mitigate the potential harm caused by fake images online, maybe the best strategy is to invest in educational efforts to increase users' digital media literacy. Second, issue attitude has a significant effect as well. Just as we expected, confirmation bias is at play, right? The more you already believe in something, the more likely you would think an image depicting something to be real and credible, right? So this is, very, very makes a lot of sense, not earth-shattering at all. So what does that leave us then? That's a big question. A lot of the factors we try to manipulate had no effect at all. And the factors that does have an effect are two things. Digital media literacy, it is something we can invest in. We can educate people. Does that mean we need to empower the individuals? We need to pour money into educating the public, improve their digital media literacy and whatnot. And what can we do to solve the misinformation problem? If, as the results show, that the burden is squarely on the individuals, does that mean the platforms are off the hook? What are the things the platforms can do to solve the misinformation problem? Okay, so with that question, we conducted a third study. So this study, we looked at correction efforts and specifically to use something called image forensic labels in order to fight multimodal misinformation on platforms. And this is, I think, the most applicable and practical solutions we investigated from a platform's point of view. And so this is published in 2021, and this QR code will get you directly to the paper itself if you want to know more about it. So we started by looking at existing fact-checking services, such as Hoaxy, Politifact is another big one, and the Snopes, something I just mentioned earlier. So they're mostly about textual information rather than visual information, right? Hoaxy is a search engine. Politifact systematically fact-checks people's statements, and Snopes as well. Now, very recently, we came across some social media companies' own effort in fighting fake news using machine learning and fact checkers to detect fake news. So a screenshot I took from the video is something like this. I don't know if they have actually rolled out the effort, but this is definitely in beta testing when we conducted the study. So Facebook, they have partnerships with independent third-party fact checkers. Right, so the stories, if they're rated as false by the fact checkers, they will be shown lower in newsfeed. And then if the pages or domains repeatedly create or share misinformation, Facebook will significantly reduce their distribution and remove their advertising rights. Okay, so we call this a concurrent effort or concurrent labeling. Okay, so Politifact website and the Facebook fact-checking process represent two ways of thinking, okay? So I call this Facebook model concurrent model of fact-checking because as people are scrolling in their newsfeed, they see those labels at the same time, simultaneously, right? So you make the credibility assessment after receiving the fact-checking information. however brief it is. In other words, people, the viewers, they make one assessment only, right? You make the assessment after being exposed to the label. Now, another very big fact-checking website in the United States is called Politifact. Now, Politifact is a post-exposure fact-checking effort. So the Politifact model requires 2 credibility assessments. Now, think about why people would come to a site like Politifact. That's because they're already exposed to a claim, to a story, and whatnot. So when they were exposed the first time, they already made a credibility judgment. And then maybe they feel something is wrong, and then they come to Politifact to make a second credibility judgment. So we call this post-exposure. People get exposed to fact-checking information after they are exposed to the story in the first place. So in designing our study to test the dehoaxing process, we took these 2 models into account. Just to let you know, this is the current technology for image forensics. Typically, you can go to a site like Photo Forensics or Tiny Eye or something like that. What these sites would do is that it will give you a bunch of technical data, but it doesn't give you a very definitive answer of whether this image was photoshopped or not. Again, very inaccessible, and the results are subject to interpretation. Okay, so left a lot to be desired. But for a website like Politifact, it is very visual, and you can see the truth or veracity of the information very visually. Right? You don't have to process a bunch of technical data in order to arrive your own decision. So we think the Politifact model with a truth-o-meter, right? So this barometer on the right side is something the image fact checkers should adopt as well. Okay, something that's not ambiguous, unlike a lot of other current image forensic tools. So inspired by Politifact, we developed our own forensic label. We call this picture-o-meter. So we went through a few iterations, all pre-tested. Now, just know that we didn't design a technical system to spit out a result. We just designed the labels themselves. Okay, so the technical system actually already exists, but they are not connected to such a front-end label, forensic label just yet. Currently, not yet. So we have designed this forensic label, and we want to test whether it is effective in changing people's view about information veracity. So again, we designed a massive experiment. We deployed our forensic label. So on the one hand, it says altered, the image is altered. On the other hand, it says it is unaltered, so it's green. And then we manipulated 2 modes of labeling, right? So one is post-exposure labeling. In other words, it's more of the Politifact model where you get exposed to the image, to the story first. And then I will show you the forensic label, whether that's altered or non-altered. And the second model is the concurrent label, more like this Facebook fact checker label. So as you look at the thumbnails of the story, it tells you whether this is altered or unaltered. And then there's a third group that's control. There is no analysis, no label at all. We also vary the source of the forensic analysis, right? Some are from experts, some are from other people online, some are from software. We try to test this because studies have shown that people tend to believe that softwares are impartial, which cannot be further from the truth, right? But somehow the majority of the people tend to think of software, oh, they're not biased. So they're going to trust software more than experts or other people online. So we tested that as well. So just to very quickly go over the results, we found that the labels are very effective. So forensic labels are very effective. If we compare the altered label with the control group or the unaltered label, you'll find that people who are exposed to a forensic label that this image is altered, they tend to rate that image much lower than in the control group where there's no label or when they receive a label that this image is unaltered. And the unaltered label and the control label are practically the same. What does that tell you? It tells you that by default, people think images are real. No changes whatsoever, no manipulations, okay? The default is that they are believable. So that's our biggest finding. Another big finding is that factors associated with their perceived credibility rating, again, is affected by the participants' political ideology, their internet skills, their digital media literacy, and their pro-issue attitude. So again, we found the same thing as we did in the previous study, right? So confirmation bias is still very much at play despite the forensic label. And digital media literacy still matters despite the label. So we found user features, participants with higher media literacy, more skeptical of the credibility, image aligned with their pre-existing issue attitude, were more likely to be perceived as credible. Okay. All right, so I have fast forward through 3 studies looking at how people process various image mockups, and we systematically tested what non-image cues and image cues mattered. And in the end, I think the big takeaway is that these things actually don't matter that much. What mattered is people's pre-existing issue attitude, which unfortunately, very hard to change. You know, as you can see, every year, lots and lots and lots of money being poured into advertisements, into political campaigns and whatnot. And the actual persuasive effect is minimal. So it's insanely difficult to change people's opinion, okay? The second thing that matters is people's digital media literacy. So maybe as media researchers, we could do some things there. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to introduce to you a few ongoing projects. They're very much ongoing, and I don't have formalized the results, so I'm very happy to hear from the audience what your thoughts are, and maybe I can incorporate those feedbacks into these ongoing studies. The first ongoing study is we're trying to use low-cost intervention to encourage fact-checking misattributed images. Okay, what do I mean by misattributed images? Well, in the past 3 studies, we talked about very heavily photoshopped images, right? But there is one category of fake images that we discussed earlier. That is, the image itself actually had no problem. The image itself was intact. But somehow we can put this image in a completely different context. That can be extremely misleading. And because that image cannot be detected by any technical methods, right? Because image is true, the image has veracity. So what do you do with that? So that can be a very extremely dangerous category of multimodal misinformation. So we're currently developing low-cost intervention, try to encourage people to fact-check those misattributed images. And we got our inspiration from a recent intervention from Twitter. So for those who use Twitter in the crowd, you've probably noticed that maybe earlier this year, Twitter has rolled out something like this. So when you are trying to retweet a story on Twitter without clicking through the story first, Twitter would warn you or give you a little nudge, right? It asks you to read the story first before sharing. So all it is doing is to create some kind of friction for dissemination of information. Remember, one of the studies I talked about, it find out that misinformation spreads faster and to more people than true information on Twitter, right? So Twitter is exactly trying to prevent that from happening. So one way of doing that is to ask people to actually read through the link. So we thought, what if we do something similar for images? Okay, so we give participants a little nudge. Okay, so this is something we came up with. So There are many such infographics online. So I think this one is from Common Sense Media. Anyway, we took it, we adapted for our purposes. What it tells you is to do a reverse image search, right? So reverse image search is very powerful for spotting image that's misattributed to a different context, right? You just reverse search it on Google, but not everybody knows how to do it or even that this exists. So we took this infographic, we showed to our participants, we encourage them to do a little task of reverse image search before showing them misattributed images. So that's one condition, the active intervention. And we also developed a similar infographic, but this time they don't have to complete a task. All they have to do is read through this infographic, knowing that reverse search exists. Okay, so we call this passive intervention. So with the active intervention, where participants have to complete a task of reverse search, and a passive intervention where all they have to do is read through the infographic, knowing that reverse search works. And then there's a control group that sees nothing, right? And then we show them different misattributed images. And we're trying to see if there's any effect from these very low cost interventions. So that's the first ongoing study. The second ongoing study, we ventured into not just images, but also audio, and in this case, short videos. So we are taking a computational, more of a big data, automatic video analysis approach. We're trying to look for features of fact-checking videos and then see what kind of a visual or auditory features will contribute to more engagement, to more audience acceptance, and things like that. So we took, we sampled from Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok, very, very popular short video platform in Chinese. And then there are a lot of fact-checking accounts on Douyin. So we systematically downloaded all the fact-checking videos from Douyin, from these accounts. And then we do automatic video and auditory and image analysis, try to extract features that we think will contribute to the effectiveness of these videos. So that's the second ongoing project. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all my wonderful collaborators who I had the fortune to work with on these projects, and I'm going to stop here and would love to hear questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. It was such an insightful and really in-depth presentation, and I think we've all learned new things, and I personally have learned a lot about multimodal detection and research, especially related to misinformation and credibility evaluation. So I have some questions myself, but I think there was some in the audience that that really has raised their hands virtually for quite some time during your presentation. So one of them is Nilesh Gokali. Would you like to ask Cindy some your question that you have? Nilesh, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Let me see whether we still can get Nilesh. Nilesh. Okay, maybe while Nilesh, while one of our administrator or the organizer gets Nilesh to chat, let's ask the questions that are actually on the Q&A board. Chaitanya asks, is there any proof checking for videos? I think you provided or you shared some proof checking for videos, similar to the EFXI, as you mentioned for photos. Basically, I think what he or she is asking is whether are there any proof checking for mass consumer use? Yep, Cindy.
Yeah, so I would say that there has been some technical solutions, but unfortunately they are not accessible because most videos, when you think about it, most videos when you publish that there lots of editing goes into that, right? So if the technical solution itself looks for any evidence of editing, then almost all video are fake because they've been edited. So that's why all the technical solutions are very difficult for the common consumer like myself. And the same goes for images. But for images, I think there is some degree of expectation that this is intact. Maybe we do like little retouch here, retouch there, but most of all, it is intact. But for videos, it's very hard to shot something, especially professional quality videos, and then upload it without any editing at all. That's why the technical solutions are there. But the technical solutions also take a great deal of resources and knowledge in order to arrive at a half-decent conclusion. And it is definitely not for the average consumer at this point, unfortunately. So that's why I think videos can be the next frontier for the combat of misinformation. And I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately, because the research already shown that people are very vulnerable to images. Now, if you add audio, if you add video, it is a disaster in the making. So I do think that, ordinary consumers like us, there is something we can do. We can improve our digital media literacy. We can be more vigilant. But in the end, there isn't much else we can do. And I think the platforms definitely should shoulder more responsibilities because, we don't have the ability to do it. So if we don't have the ability to do it, someone has to take responsibility. And I think I should place that responsibility squarely on the media organizations and platforms.
Oh, interesting point, Cindy. So largely media organizations and platforms. What about education? What about policies? Do they have responsibilities to play also?
Most definitely. So I think one of the big takeaways from some of the studies I talked about today is that digital media literacy is very, very important. It is extremely important. So I think from a policymaker standpoint, we should most definitely invest in this area because I think this is most cost efficient, right? In our fight against political misinformation or fight against health-related or science-related misinformation, improving people's digital media literacy is extremely important. So definitely invest in that area. But my prior comment should be understood as that, yes, digital media literacy is important. We should invest, but we can't stop at that. So we definitely should take a multi-pronged approach, right? We need to educate the public, but at the same time, we shouldn't let platforms off the hook either, because I think they have the responsibility to do more.
Okay, well taken. Now, let me get back to Nilesh. Are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, yeah, thanks.
Right, thank you for a very wonderful and insightful presentation.
Thank you.
My question is from the perspective of brands, because a lot of times misinformation gets spread about brands, and obviously it would either result into a crisis or the brands would have to intervene, and then there is huge cost associated with it. So in this scenario, onus is on whom as far as media literacy is concerned? Would brands extend themselves and get into the domain of building digital media literacy, or would they restrict themselves just to handle the crisis for the given moment?
That's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about. It's a really interesting angle. So in my work, I've mainly looked at misinformation from, let's say, propaganda, right? Political misinformation and health-related misinformation. Never really ventured into brand-related misinformation. So my naive opinion at this point is I think brands tend to not to proactively, take the proactive role in educating the public. But maybe they should. I don't know, especially for the larger brands who had the resources, and maybe they could form a coalition of some sort, because this is in their best interest to do so as well, right? Instead of trying to put out fire every time, maybe they need to think about a different approach, try to stop the fire from its source. So I think this is a really interesting perspective. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nilesh. Okay, there's a question related to one of the studies here by Renwen Zhang. So she thanks so much, Dr. Shen, for the thought-provoking talk. So in regard to your second experiment, it seemed like a majority of the study participants were liberal young adults. Do you think the findings of this study will hold or be consistent among conservatives and perhaps low-income people? If you can answer.
Yeah, very good question. So for second study, we thought about people's political spectrum, and for any kind of social science studies in the U.S., it is unavoidable. You have to think about that. So our approach was that we recruited a Mechanical Turk, which it's not perfect, but for the purpose of our study, we need a huge sample, and for the purpose of the study and considering cost effectiveness, this seems to be the only viable approach at that time. Turkers have many quirks as well, so we can't simply say that Turkers are like the general population. They're not. I do agree with you that maybe they are more liberal leaning than the general population. They actually their income is not that great if you compare that with the general population. So another thing we did is that we recruited a student sample from UC Davis and tried to compare that with the Turkers, and it turns out it's fairly comparable. So we have more confidence there, because most social science studies are actually based on college students, which, as we know, is not representative of the general population either. So in the two ongoing studies, we have a little bit more resource. So we are trying to get census matched samples instead of just, any warm body from the internet. So hopefully it will be better, more representative. Now back to the question about liberal and conservative. We actually do have a sizable number of respondents in our studies that are more on the conservative side. And in the third study, when we included that, we did find that the conservative people somehow tend to be more credulous. In other words, they are more trusting. I don't know if a sample is big enough to make that conclusion. We didn't really make that conclusion, but it shows up in the data. So they are more gullible, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Let's see whether we have anyone else who wishes to ask a question. Now, this is a segment where it usually keeps silent for a couple of seconds because we're just waiting for someone to ask a question. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or raise your hands. Okay, while we are waiting to ask your question or formulate your question, I have a couple of questions myself, Cindy. So, well, you presented very interestingly the Mike Pence photo, and I think that's very interesting. It really tells quite a bit. I guess my question is, but you didn't quite conclude whether the photo is actually fake or not, because from the social media or from online commentators, it seems that yes, they're shouting fake, right, because of the non-reflection. But from a geometric technological kind of insight, it is consistent in your words that it is accurate. So what's is it accurate or is it fake?
Right. So according to my collaborator, who's a computer graphics professor, the photo is real. The photo is real. So that example just shows you that, when we're trying to find something that's inconsistent, we just don't have the ability. Our naked eye is not equipped to detect something like that. So as also shows up in the focus group study, when we asked the participants what is wrong with these images, they point to the completely different areas. So all these examples, I'm trying to make a point, is that we're vulnerable and we're not equipped. We don't have the ability to tell whether this image is intact or not, which makes it all the more important that someone who has the resources and the technical ability to take responsibility for that. So that means the platforms.
I totally agree with you, but putting on my humanities kind of perspective also, in that case, then we are putting our faith in the evaluation, faith, if you may, in a broad sense, on the technological indicators, right? But it might not be accurate, or I do not know. Eventually, it seems that it has to boil down to the source itself. Mike Pence or people who are actually seeing it at that particular situation, or who can verify the information in that particular setting. I'm not so sure your thought. So it's either putting it on technology, doing the geometric and doing the calculations to actually conclude that it's true or false, or basing it on the source, or basing it on humans' evaluation, which can also be insightful, because as humans see the image and there's a collective evaluation going on, there's a social evaluation going on, and and people can actually do the cyber sleuthing online, and for example say, oh, actually I found Mike Pence in another place in another location at that particular time which he posts. You get what I mean? And helping one another to verify that information collectively. So which among this it's I don't know, I think it's a toss-up, but what are your thoughts on this?
Wow, that was very philosophical. Thank you. I've actually didn't think through it from this angle. So on the very surface level, I think whether an image has been manipulated, it should have a definitive answer. That's a social scientist speaking. There's a social scientist speaking. But I think another layer of this is that the image itself could be intact, but it could be misattributed in different contexts. And that will be, a little bit harder to spot, right? That will be a little bit harder to spot. I still tend to believe that there should be a technical answer, or at least a somehow, high probability answer to give us the objective truth of whether something has been tampered with or not. Okay. Otherwise, it's just very difficult for me to trust anything in this media environment, especially when you throw in the audio and the video, and everything else. So I still choose to believe there has to be some kind of objective truth, although I completely understand from a humanist perspective, maybe there is no objective truth. Okay, so I think this is a very thought-provoking question. I don't have a very good answer for it. And if any panelists or audience wanted to chime in, please feel free. I'm very intrigued by your comments, Elmie.
Yeah, so anyone wants to chime in? And for your information, I do experiments. I'm a social scientist also. But in thinking through our own findings and our own interpretations, we always grapple with such, challenges, right? On how can we conclude in that sense. Anyone else have any question? Oh, there is a Q&A. There's another question. All right, so there's another question by Guilherme Zagati. You type it down in the chat in the question and answer box, but would you like to, just unmute yourself and ask the question? Would you want to do that, Guilherme? Perhaps you can actually explain the question better for me, for fearing of me misinterpreting the questions. Guilherme? Oh, Guilherme. Okay, I don't think he want, or they can't unmute. Okay, I'm sorry. Then I will just read out the questions for everyone's sake. Okay, so thanks, Dr. Shen, for your talk. It seems like one of the main problems of social media is the environment that they engender. Allow images to be interpreted in any way intended, right? So the authenticity of images play a catalytic role, but it is not necessarily the main problem. What are your thoughts on this? And similarly, I have a similar thought along the lines of Guilherme's question, in that what is the role of images then? Not to hijack the question, perhaps you can answer the question, but following which I kind of have the idea that you conclude in your series of studies that image is by itself is not indicative of truth, and it's the contextual or the textual information in your first study that signifies the credibility. And in your second study, it's the level of digital literacy that one has that will actually affect whether he or she evaluates the image credibility. So in line with Guillermo's question, what is then is the main problem here, and what are your thoughts on this?
Right, that's a very good comment. So I want to reiterate that when studying image in a misinformation context, we specifically could think about things like news. So in a news context, when you see an image, you assume this is truth. So a photographic image represents truth. I don't mean image in any other form, especially in social media, right? Image can be anything, memes or whatever. It can show your emotions or whatever. So I don't mean image in that sense. Here in the misinformation context, image was assumed to represent photographic truth. And in this context that I study images, that's why I said image has to be understood with the context, that the image itself can be true, but if you misrepresent it, right, then it becomes falsehood. Okay, does that clear it up?
Yep.
Yeah, and especially in the so another area I didn't really touch upon today is memes. And memes is sort of in between. So it's not exactly news. People don't understood meme as, oh, this is photographic truth. But on the other hand, memes can also be used to convey misinformation. And we see this a lot, especially in, so one of the ongoing projects I looked at is to look at anti-vaccine information on Instagram. Right? Anti-vaccine information on Instagram. So a lot of the like babies or like needles or all that information or Dr. Fauci, for example, there are lots of Dr. Fauci memes circling around. And then each time when you see the face of Dr. Fauci, sometimes it's anti-vaxxers having an anti-vaccine message on the meme, but sometimes it's pro-vaxxers having a pro-vaxxer meme. It's all Dr. Fauci, but the Dr. Fauci's head position may be different, the facial expression may be different, and things like that. So another ongoing project we're looking at is try to take a departure from the project where we recognize image as photographic truth. So in this case, we use image as a background, right? That's what memes do. Memes use the image as a background, trying to convey a message. So in this case, we're trying to look at different visual features of the image itself, see whether they have anything to do with the message itself. So for example, if you just observe Dr. Fauci memes in those Instagram communities, you'll typically find that if Dr. Fauci was somehow portrayed in a not very favorable light, there's a high degree it's an anti-vax meme. If Dr. Fauci is presented in a somewhat favorable light, like it's bright, smiling, things like that, it's usually pro-vaccine, right? So there, I mean, this is something that you can observe with naked eye, but there are other things that you cannot observe with the naked eye. That's why in this project, we're trying to look at specific visual features and how they're associated with the credibility of the image itself.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting explanation indeed. And when I look at photographs, I guess one way to also look at it also is like the effect of the photograph that kind of produces an outcome that mediates eventually the evaluation that comes out of it. And one of it is perhaps emotions. And I think a lot of a strand of research is emotions, that it doesn't quite exactly objectively tell whether a certain piece of news or information is accurate or true, but it somehow evokes or elicits a certain response. And in your example, the response is a trigger to pro and con of a particular, the valence or the pros and cons of a particular information, and therefore then it biases the outcome, the evaluation process. So I guess, yeah, so thank you, Dr. Shen, for showing us the significance of image. I think a lot more research has to be done in this aspect. Let's move on to the next question. Wilson. Wilson, basically, I'm very interested in your research and your data. I think he or she wishes to further pursue future collaboration with you. So we'll take this offline, Wilson. I think we'll pass you the information on Cindy, and you can actually email her online directly to actually collaborate and get the data sets and data sources.
Yes.
I think that's the spirit of this forum, right?
Yes.
So to nurture future collaborations. So let's move on to the next question. So from Sean, thank you so much, Prof. Shinde, for sharing your thoughts on promising future directions in misinformation studies. Could you share your thoughts on the future of research on cross-platform propagation of misinformation in the field? By cross-platform, it's not clear what he means by this. I'll give it to you, Cindy, to actually just define the cross-platform in your answers, and what are the research opportunities and gaps. So, Cindy, to you.
That's an excellent question and excellent comment. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much research in this space, cross-platform, right? So, for example, the rumor started on Twitter, let's say, and then somehow it spread to Instagram or TikTok, and then it made it into mainstream media, and then it goes back to social media, right? So a few things. One is that it definitely exists, and I think a more clear example would be Donald Trump. I mean, I hate to mention this, but there are so many prime examples associated with Donald Trump. So last year, there has been multiple instances where he himself or his team had started some kind of rumor or unconfirmed information on social media, and then picked up by mainstream media like CNN or Fox News. And then his team then tweeted that, oh, CNN reported this, Fox reported this. So it is all something that his team started on social media, and because of his stature, and then it got picked up by a different platform. And then they used the evidence of this picked up by a different platform as evidence that this is credible, right? It's all ridiculous if you think about it, but anyway, the phenomena definitely exists. The reason that it hasn't been studied so much is, I think, the significant hurdle in getting information from multiple platforms. I think getting information maybe from a single platform is already hard enough, and not to mention that some of these propaganda machines are kind of scattered around, so it's difficult to scrub data from different sources. But I think personally, this is a very, very, very important area and definitely worth studying. So if you're an enterprising researcher, I would highly encourage you to undertake this research effort.
Thank you. Okay, we have like 5 more minutes left. And we all want to have Professor Shen to close and give us some final closing remarks. So if there are any other questions, okay, yeah, Bernice got one in just in time. Bernice Lin, very enriching and insightful talk. What are some possible limitations of the network analytical approach to understanding social behavior? Mm-hmm. Perhaps you can put it in the context.
Good question. So just to clarify, this is based on very massive online experiments. We didn't actually, look at network structure. It will be fun to look at network structure, but that's not what we did. I would say online experiment research, it suffers the same drawbacks of experiment in that it is very artificial. So we all know that people don't read tweets, or they don't encounter images, in an online survey. It's just not how they would consume information organically in their own research environment. And another thing that has been very difficult to study is that the engagement behaviors. And if you want to do it experimentally, that's extremely difficult because there's no way for us to collect data on how people retweet news posts given our own mockups. It's just impossible, right? So we can build, actually in UC Davis, we did build a in-house experimental platform that looks like Facebook. It has the same functionalities. You can like it, you can comment it, you can share it, but it is useless because it doesn't have your own Facebook friends, right? It's not the same. Even though it has the same functionalities, it does not simulate the social experience you normally have on these platforms. So I don't think we have come across a good way of making this as natural or organic as possible. So we have to settle for this artificial experiment. So what we gain in order to make a causal inference is what we lose to, artificiality. It's just not how people consume information in a natural setting. So if you have any ideas of how we could improve this study environment, you will be making a huge contribution to computational social science, I can assure you. And do not let that challenge stop you. And so I do hope that some of you in the audience will be able to take that challenge.
And I think most of us, including myself, are inspired by your talk and your speech to take on that challenge and pursue this line of inquiry in computational communication applied to misinformation research. Okay, so we have like 3 minutes left, and let me just tie it all back to the talk, which is basically about combating online information. And I think it was insightful, it was precise, it was on point, and a lot of factors, and you have shared with us a lot of factors and influences that just makes combating online information not only challenging, but you've provided insights like digital media literacy and some of your findings. I guess being a keynote speech, perhaps, or keynote talk, perhaps you can actually share with us the future of online misinformation vis-a-vis doctored images. Do you think it's going to get a bit trickier? Do you think humans in general being more attuned to consuming and communicating in social network settings, in digital communication settings, will get familiarized to this and more inoculated, if I may? Or will technology just be too fast moving that humans will just be playing catch up to the level of misinformation in respect to doctored or images online? So I'll leave it to you to close the keynote. Thanks, Professor.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Nek. That's a really very good prompt for me to think through. And I can share a few speculations, personal speculations. I have no way of knowing, but over the past few years, I have talked to many journalists who are extremely worried about that prospect as well. So not just academics, but journalists, people who work for media organizations. So I think there are a few possibilities, and I can lay them out. The first possibility is that we limit misinformation at their source. Now, how do we do that? There are several ways of doing that, and I'm especially counting on social media platforms to do their part. Right. So in the last year, we've seen some experimentations by Twitter, for example, try to limit harmful information, but not misinformation. Right. So they draw a line in the sand about, oh, this is going to cause harm, social unrest, whatever. So they ban certain accounts. But it was never based on misinformation, or definitely not based on misinformation alone. So can we expect these platforms to take a stance to cut the source? I don't know. I think that's an open question, and I'm not super optimistic. The second possibility, I think, is a technical solution. But the technical solution for doctored images or doctored videos, I think I have more faith in that. But when you place something, in a different context, this problem cannot be solved by a technical solution alone, right? I think technical solutions can help, but ultimately it has to rely on some kind of human judgment or some kind of agreed upon a consensus of objective truth. Judging from what happened in the US last year, again, I'm not super optimistic. A third possibility is that we will train people, we will educate people, we will make investment in digital media literacy. But would that solve all the problem? Again, I'm not super optimistic. If you have experienced the Great Division, in the United States over the past few years, we'll find that digital media solution probably is not the solution for the social problems. It might be a band-aid, but it does not solve the deep distrust or the division of views on so many different social issues as to people then, have a very deep distrust of certain public institutions or media organizations, right? To an extent where no kind of media literacy education will be able to persuade someone on the other side of the aisle that New York Times is trustworthy or CNN is trustworthy. Being a media researcher and educator myself, I think it's very unfortunate for me to come to that conclusion. And I hope I'm proven wrong, but it's the very unfortunate truth that I have witnessed in the past several years. So maybe people will be divided based on their belief of what source is trustworthy.
Right.
I think that's entirely possible.
Thank you so much. So there we have it.
Sorry to end on a very pessimistic note.
It is what it is. No, but thank you so much, Prof. Shen. And we've come to the end of our keynote session number 2. Our next session will be at 2 p.m. and we'll have our papers presentation according to the themes. If you need to know any information or you need to get in touch with any of our keynote speakers, in the chat box there's a link to the email for the program, and you can find their contact details over there. So if you may, just in your own space, give a quiet round of applause in your room for Prof. Cindy Shen. And thank you so much, Cindy.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And see everyone.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.